Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko. Today we're asking, should drugs be decriminalised? This week, former heroin addict and now comedian Russell Brand told politicians that they should regard drug addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal or judicial matter. Brand himself has been arrested a number of times for drug possession and said it would be a brilliant idea if the policing costs of arresting people for possession were channeled towards treatment and drug education programs. Russell Brand's appearance before the panel has reopened the debate on how to deal with drug addiction in our society. Is the government wasting money by policing minor drugs offences? And should the government policy be altered? If so, then how? And would decriminalisation lead to a rapid rise in drug use or send the wrong message to young people? To discuss, I'm joined in the studio by Gyngell. She's a policy analyst at the Centre for Policy Studies. Leo Barasi, who's the head of communications at the UK Drug Policy Commission, and Niamh Eastwood, who's executive director of the Release charity. And on the phone from Russia, we have Alexey Kalgashkin, who's the editor-in-chief of the No to Drugs web resource. If we just dive straight in to the heart of the matter, should drugs be illegal or should they be regulated? Niamh, I'd like to start with you. What's your take?
Polina, this is a complicated issue, and obviously there's a number of policy options that we could pursue in relation to drugs. It's not just simply illegal or regulated. There's a number of models that could be adopted. Currently, within the UK and with other European countries, we've seen a prohibitionist model whereby the criminal laws are used to try and dictate how people behave in terms of their drug use, so that the criminalisation of drugs and drug use is presupposed to deter use. Now, we would argue that that's not the case. And the model that Release advocates for is decriminalisation of drug possession. So drug supply would still be illegal under that model, but people wouldn't be criminalised for their drug use. So instead what would happen is they would either be dealt with through the civil system, whereby they wouldn't end up with a criminal record and all the damage that comes with that, so how it impacts on employment, on education, on travel. And instead they would receive an administrative response, either a fine or a referral to treatment or to education. We believe that this is a much more pragmatic approach to drug possession issues, and also to the evidence supports it.
Can I just turn to Kathy? Mm-hmm. Now, you've said it yourself, a lot of high-profile people support decriminalisation. Richard Branson, George Soros. What's your take on the issue? I mean, you were at the Home Affairs Select Commission speaking against the decriminalisation of drugs.
Well, I agree with Niamh. I think we have to make separate decriminalisation from legalisation. And when you talk about drugs being illegal, in fact, we do have a regulatory system already. We have an international drugs control system that we abide by, and we do have to have that. I think, as Niamh would probably agree, because a lot of drugs coming out are not safe. They never will be safe. And we have to have a system that ensures we have the legitimate needs for medical drugs produced and met. At the same time, we have to make sure that things that have not passed through a medical process and have no medical justification, people are protected from them. And that's essentially what our system does. I'm not saying, and I've never said it couldn't be reformed or improved. And indeed, probably I've got levels of real agreement with Niamh about the best use of the criminal justice system. And the best use of the criminal justice system is to divert people into treatment where necessary. But I would say on a sentenced basis. I think this gives people a chance to be brought up short and stop doing something that damages themselves and other people.
If we just turn to Russia for a moment, Alexei, has anyone ever suggested decriminalisation of drugs in Russia to deal with the Russian problem of drug addiction that's so rife?
Well, hello, London. I should say that right now we are in heated discussion about should we introduce treatment instead of punishment. Well, problem is that you need, I think, to strike a balance. If you treat an addicted person as a sick person, of course you can't punish him or her for the sickness. But at the same time, I'm afraid that decriminalisation can, under certain conditions, convey a message that drugs are acceptable or tolerated in the society, and that, I think, is not good.
Niamh, you had a point to make.
I think Alex is right that we should look at drug use as a health issue, but I don't think that the criminal justice system is a useful model to support anybody's health issues. And actually, if we look at the evidence, Alex has said that decriminalisation is a green light to tolerate drug use. That's simply not borne out by the countries that have adopted it. We've just done a paper that's about to be published that covers jurisdictions that have adopted decriminalisation models. There's about 25 to 30 throughout the world, either everything from full decriminalisation of all drugs through to just decriminalisation of marijuana. In all of those jurisdictions, we haven't seen a significant increase in drug use at all.
Does it send the wrong message to young children, though, and young people?
I think it's very important we understand what the drug laws can and cannot achieve. In the UK, we have still a relatively bad drug problem, but actually it has been improving in recent years. At the same time as it's been improving, this has also been when we've been moving towards some de facto decriminalisation of the way that we treat some drugs. So it's clearly...
Have we, though? Marijuana was...
That's actually a very good example. So with marijuana, we've introduced systems, cannabis warning, which is a less punitive system than we previously had.
But it was downgraded to Class C and then upgraded
and
again.
Fascinatingly, when it was downgraded to Class C and then re-upgraded, all the way through this, it was in a steadily decreasing pattern of use. So that's a very, very good natural experiment to demonstrate that actually the level of control of cannabis, whether it's Class B or Class C, didn't seem to have any impact purely on level of use. And there might well be interesting points about patterns of use and how it's used, which might be slightly different. But purely on the level of use, the strictness of the punishment doesn't seem to make a difference.
Can I turn to Kathy for a moment?
Where I'd fundamentally disagree with Leo on his argument is that de facto decriminalisation has a much longer history than since the downgrading of cannabis and its upgrading, which I agree made very little difference on one level. But if you look at where it really has happened, the experiment we did in Brixton, it was an absolute disaster where decriminalisation became actual under Paddock, and it fueled drug warfare. It made it impossible for the young people there. And I think what it does, it leaves the most vulnerable communities completely unprotected. We have had declining drug use. I suspect it's not on one level related to the drug laws, but on the other hand, I do think that if you put up the green light, you stop I think it was probably a cultural thing beginning to happen. So this is not the point you put up the white flag to surrender, because you're almost going against what people instinctively want, and they don't basically want drugs, and they now know how terribly harming and damaging they are to children.
Niamh.
Just 2 points. Firstly, we do not have de facto decriminalisation of drugs in the UK. The reality is 80,000 people a year are prosecuted, are found guilty, or are cautioned for drug offences, including cannabis. That's the reality. They're ending up with criminal records which are hugely harmful. Secondly, the UK still has one of the highest rates of drug use in Europe. That cannot be ignored. And the reality is that we have to be advocating a system where we deal with drugs through education and health. We should not be criminalising people simply because they consume a substance.
Kathy, do you think the police spend too much time on prosecuting minor drug offences?
Of the bits I agreed with Russell Brand, who might be abstinent, but his behaviour was hardly abstinent in front of the Home Affairs Committee. Of the bits I agree with him that nothing is authentic in our system. He kept using this word authentic. And to that extent, I really completely disagree with Niamh. We do have de facto decriminalisation. I've actually got all the drugs convictions stuff with me. And if you look at possession of Class A, just in one recent year, you have about over 13,000 found guilty. Only 900 of those got immediate custody. It's a very low proportion for a Class A drug. The cannabis warnings hold no legal the majority, by far the greatest majority, is cannabis warnings, nothing else. It has no legal sanction basis at all.
Niamh, if we turn to you for a moment.
Just quickly, as a lawyer, Kathy is absolutely right. Cannabis warnings do not have any impact on a criminal record. But what has happened with cannabis warnings is they were introduced in 2003 when we had the first reclassification. And essentially, we've seen a net widening effect. So the same numbers of people are being prosecuted as prior to the introduction of cannabis warnings now as they were then. And all we have is 80,000 more people receiving cannabis warnings and potentially being escalated up into the criminal justice system.
Is there any chance that the government's actually going to do anything and answer to the calls of the, as you say, the pro-drugs lobbyists? Is there a chance of this happening, Niamh?
Well, in terms of, first of all, the pro-drugs lobby, people who advocate for pragmatic responses to drug use are not pro-drugs. We are pro-social justice. We are pro-stopping the criminalisation of essentially our young people and people who are very vulnerable. That's what's happening in our system. I think in terms of the government doing anything in this, we've got an economic crisis at the moment. The government is in disarray. The likelihood of them dealing with drug policy is limited, but the outcome of the Home Affairs Select Committee should be an interesting
report to read.
Exactly.
Leo, what about you? What do you think?
I can't speak for what the government are going to do, but it is interesting that for about a year and a half now, their official advisory body, who are an independent body of drugs experts from across drugs field, have been saying possession of drugs, and I quote, for personal use, people should not be processed through the criminal justice system, but instead be diverted into drug education awareness courses or possibly other creative civil punishments like loss of driving licence or passport.
And just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the decriminalisation of drugs. I'm joined in the studio by Kathy Gyngell. She's a policy analyst at the Centre for Policy Studies. Leo Barasi, who's the head of communications at the UK Drug Policy Commission, and Niamh Eastwood, who's executive director of the Release charity. And on the phone from Russia, we have Alexey Kalgashkin, who's the editor-in-chief of the No to Drugs web resource. Education, we've just had in his address to the Home Affairs Committee, Chip Summers, the chief executive of the drug rehabilitation charity Focus 12. He called for more honest information on drugs in schools. What do each of you think of the drug education that we have as it is at the moment, Kathy?
We've had a drug education system in schools which is pretty poor, but it has largely followed the ideological harm reduction model, and it assumes that the drug education system in our schools, such as it is, and I think we'd be hard-pressed to know exactly what is happening in the classrooms, and it's the sort of things teachers don't like doing, but it has been on an informed choice basis, so it makes the assumption that children are going to experiment. That's not true. It's also not terribly scientifically based. It tries to be cool to kids, but more than anything, it does make the assumption that children have a sort of rational, adult, mature decision-making process. We know now from brain science that the risk area of the brain it does not finally mature until it's been in the Lancet this week, until they're 24. So our real attempts must be not to sanction use, not to normalise it in any way, and to point out to children, insofar as they can absorb it, which I believe they probably can, exactly what it does to their brains and what the consequences will be there for their future. So I think there's a large room for improvement, but we can't put all our money on that. We have to put our money on actually protecting them.
Niamh.
Surprisingly, I'll agree with Kathy on some of those points. Certainly we have to educate kids about the harms of drugs.
So
That's
you
absolutely
think education
right.
needs to be...
Except I do not agree that we actually have harm reduction education in schools. I also think we have to work in reality. So
can you just clarify what you mean by harm reduction education?
Okay, so harm reduction education would be explaining to young people the dangers of drugs and explaining to them that if they decide to engage with that activity, how they can do that in the most safe manner, the safest manner possible. That's essentially it. In the same way that we do with sex education, nobody should advocate that young people should have sex, but the reality is they do. So what we do is we teach them how to do it safely. So I think we need to do more of that, and just say no campaigns don't work. That's the reality.
Leo?
Well, firstly, I would absolutely echo Niamh's final point that all the evidence is that just say no campaigns for children and young people who weren't going to use drugs, it tends to reinforce that. For those who were thinking of using drugs, they tend to ignore it. But the other point is, if we were to be honest about the risks of using drugs in schools, I think there's a point that we really need to face up to, which is about a third of the UK population have used drugs. Only about 1,600 a year die from drug-related injuries. Actually, if we were to tell the truth to young people about using drugs, we'd probably say most people can use drugs safely, which is quite possibly not a message that we would want to say.
My generation grew up with the story of a girl who had taken ecstasy for the first time, Leah Betts. That's left such an impression. Surely these campaigns can have some sort of effect.
I would disagree with both Leo and Niamh on the Just Say No campaigns. I think the jury's out on all these things. They're very difficult to measure. But given the success in America in bringing drug use down, you cannot completely take away. I mean, cocaine use dropped in America 75% in 25 years. You can't discount that this would have had any impact. On my real problem with Russell Brand at the Home Affairs Select Committee is that he implied to all those 13-year-old kids who are waiting outside to get his autograph that drug use wasn't risky. All drug use is risky. We don't know where it stops on the roulette wheel. We know about cannabis and psychosis. I know amongst my they're grown now, son's own friends, 3 or 4 cases of irreversible cannabis-induced psychosis. Absolutely. I know of 2 deaths of children because they actually thought that drug use was safe and it wouldn't happen to them.
Let's just turn to Russia again for a moment, because I think the notion that drug use is safe for probably a Russian audience is quite interesting. Alexey, has anyone ever suggested that this could be a way of educating children in Russia?
Yes, actually we have quite a number of programs that are dealing with drug education. But as usual, the problem is that not all of them are evidence-based, and in such a case as educating children, you should be very conscious that any kind of education on such a subject as drugs and drug use can sometimes lead even to more harm than not knowing.
Is it carried out in Russia across the board in all schools at the moment?
It depends on local authorities. If local authorities introduce such programs, then they are carried out.
But Russia's got a huge problem with heroin. I don't know how Russian educators deal with that.
Yes, I think that the major part of the population in our country understands that heroin is risky, and heroin is not the main drug of abuse here in our country. And I think that cannabis is far more widespread, so to say.
You mean, just to pick up on Alex's point about Russia and heroin use, I mean, the reality is that the danger that comes, or the damage that's done in terms of heroin consumption in Russia is to do with the policies that the Russian government have adopted, the lack of harm reduction, the lack of needle exchanges, the lack of methadone prescribing in the region. This is the reason why between 1997 to 2008, 80% of all new cases of HIV in Russia were linked to injecting drug use. So, I mean, one of the things I would say about education is there's no evidence that any of the education programs, Just Say No or harm reduction, actually impacts on levels of use amongst young people. What actually impacts on affecting problematic drug use are the levels of equality within the society. It's the protective factors. It's about making sure that you have strong families, that you do not have income inequalities to the level that you have in countries like Russia or even within the UK. And that's a huge problem.
It's nice to see Kathy nodding to something that Niamh is saying.
I do. I think we have a problem with vulnerable populations. I completely agree. The question is how do we help best protect them, and how do we help them climb out of their vulnerability? And if you go to Sweden, I do think you need the criminal justice system to help, because sometimes crime precedes addiction. And there are wonderful examples of using the criminal justice system to help children in Sweden and then expunging their criminal record, but with the sanction that actually if they don't cooperate, they will have a criminal record, and they work remarkably well.
And just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the decriminalisation of drugs. Leo, Kathy's talking about Sweden. Perhaps somebody was going to mention Portugal and the experience of Portugal. Could you enlighten us a bit?
Sure. Well, Portugal, a little over 10 years ago, took criminal sanctions away from personal possession of drugs. Now, the results of that have largely been disputed, and I'm sure Kathy will dispute some of the consequences with us here. But I think even within the boundaries of those disputes, the general view has been that it hasn't been a disaster. Now, some people in some circumstances think it's been a disaster. We tend to disagree, but what has been clear is that a lot of the very negative predictions from the outset that drug use would rocket, that there would be a huge amount of drug tourism, really doesn't seem to have come to fruition.
Niamh?
And just to add to that, I mean, I'd like to pick up on the point of Sweden as well, but just firstly on Portugal. The reality is that there has been a slight increase in overall drug use. That is common to the whole region. But in terms of vulnerable groups, the groups that we shouldn't be criminalising, young people and problematic drug users, we've seen a decrease in the number of young people using drugs, and we've seen the number of problematic drug users halved over that period.
We have huge problems with Portuguese data, number one, so I think it's very difficult to take it as a case at all. And even Dr. Julio, who's the head of the Portugal thing, it turns out that half of the decreases happened before 2000. So this is very problematic. Portugal is also a very different society. It's Catholic, strongly family-based. What may or may not work in Portugal could be a disaster in this country, where we have the highest rates of unmarried parenting, of single mothers, children born into families with no fathers. This doesn't happen in Portugal. You can't swap. And how different are we anyway? It's terribly complicated to do this. I don't think it's a sensible way to promote the discussion.
Leo?
I think what's really important in talking about Portugal is not to get completely blinded by the change in the law and to pay attention to actually what they did around that. Was a lot of work on discussing drug use in society and trying to destigmatise it and building up the treatment system.
Huge treatment input. So you don't know at that point whether it was the huge treatment input that was the impact. You just don't know this.
Although there is reports that say that the stigmatisation of criminalisation has impacted on the removal of the risk of criminalisation has impacted on a person's willingness to access treatment. And just in terms of Sweden, it's interesting that Kathy's quite willing to advocate for a very strict criminal justice approach and not consider the evidence around decriminalisation, which is adopted in a number of jurisdictions, not just Portugal. But in Sweden, what we have seen actually recently is an increase in HIV transmission rates because of the lack of investment in harm reduction interventions. And also, it has a higher rate of drug-related deaths than the European average. The last European Centre on Drug and Drug-Related Data reported that. So, that's what the European Monitoring Centre is saying.
We have had a very strong harm reduction system here. We've had needle distribution. We've had massive investment in methadone. HIV's gone up, doubled amongst the injecting populations. Methadone related, all opiate deaths, all drug deaths have gone up, and the proportion of those with methadone complicit in it have gone up dramatically.
If I turn to have a look at rehabilitation, because you've mentioned it, and I'm interested in, first of all, asking Alexey, what's your take on forced rehabilitation? Because in Russia there was a very controversial story about a man who was prosecuted and put on trial for working in a charity that forced heroin addicts into forced rehabilitation, and it was a big controversy in Russia about human rights of drug addicts.
Yes, there was quite a heated discussion, and it also raised the question about not state-operated rehabilitation centers. Now we are introducing a system of certification of such centers, and that, I think, will help us to provide to those people who need rehabilitation and adequate facilities and adequate treatment.
Sorry, Alexey, I just wanted to move on to Kathy and ask what she thinks of forced rehabilitation.
I think there are more or less enlightened ways of using the criminal justice system, and that sounds deeply unenlightened. There are examples of extremely enlightened projects. The main one is the Hope Project in Hawaii, which has been most extraordinarily successful. It's a probation program that works with really, really past serious offenders, drug users, and it works through a drug testing and probation regime, and it's not punitive in that sense. It doesn't take away human rights. It actually accords respect for human possibility of what people can achieve following very, very troubled lives.
Kathy?
Rehabilitation is certainly something that we would advocate should be part of the treatment system, residential rehab. That's absolutely right. But there has to be a range of options in order to engage people in the treatment system, like needle exchanges, like methadone prescribing. And also I'm just slightly concerned that if we recognise this as a serious health problem, which it is, why are we criminalising people? You mean we don't criminalise people who are obese? We don't criminalise people who smoke?
Leo, what about the crime relating to drug addiction? I was just, as a response to Niamh, UK government reports saying that 70 to 80% of all burglaries related to drugs, 85% of shoplifting, 54% of robberies.
Well, look, we all agree that we want to bring down addiction. What we're debating is the best way to do it. And I think what the story from Russia really indicates is the risk of seeing this purely as a chemical and biological problem, that you get someone, lock them in a room for 2 weeks until they no longer have a physical addiction to a particular drug, and they're in the clear. That's just not a serious way of looking at it. People's addiction is very much framed in their lifestyle, in job prospects or lack of job prospects, family support networks or lack of those.
As Russell Brand put it.
Well, exactly. And, just treating the symptom is a very, very unsustainable and unhelpful way of doing it. And I think what we all agree about, and the real risk of a very symptom-focused approaches in Russia, is missing that this is part of much wider issues for most people with drug problems. Not all, but for most.
I'm afraid I'm asking for final thoughts.
Well, I'd like to take the bit that we agree on, and let's end, because we often have big arguments about this in England. It's really nice to be constructive about it. The really sad thing in England is that good quality rehabilitation, whether you are referred to it through the criminal justice system or mainly in England it's voluntary, rehab, only 2% of our entire people who need drug treatment in this country, and we're not even talking about alcohol as well, which overlaps, get into a decent rehab system, and it's going downwards. And we've had so much emphasis on harm reduction, which I agree there's a place for it, but it is out of balance in this country. Whether it's criminal justice driven or otherwise, that fundamental balance is wrong now in this country and needs remedying.
Niamh?
I think on a broader note, I would say that it really is time for us to have a review of this area. I don't see why any advocate, whether for a continuation of the current criminal justice system or for those of us who are advocating for alternatives, wouldn't want to look at all of the evidence and look at the models and consider how they would impact in the UK. The reality is, we are criminalising our young people, and we are creating bigger barriers in terms of them engaging with society.
Thank you to all my guests today. I was joined in the studio by Kathy Gyngell. She's a policy analyst at the Centre for Policy Studies. Leo Barasi, who's the head of communications at the UK Drug Policy Commission, and Niamh Eastwood, who's executive director of the Release charity. And on the phone from Russia, we have Alexey Kalgashkin, who's the editor-in-chief of the No to Drugs web resource. Stay tuned, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko. We'll be back after the news.